UFC 247 goes down this Saturday in Houston, Texas, and it features a title fight between the one man that many people consider the GOAT in all of MMA, Jon Jones, versus the up-and-comer and also undefeated Dominick the Devastator Reyes. Now, the question on a lot of people's minds leading up to this weekend's main event is, does Dominick Reyes have a legit shot to be the one man to finally dethrone Jon Jones at the top of the light heavyweight division? The answer to that question is yes. And here's why. Wow! And it is all over! You honestly don't really need to look any further than Jon Jones' last fight against Thiago Santos to know that Dominick Reyes definitely has what I would say a pretty decent chance to beat Jon Jones. Obviously, they're not the same fighter. I think a lot of people would agree with me in saying that Thiago Santos probably has more power. He hits harder, but there's no doubt at all that Dominick Reyes also has quite a bit of power. He definitely has, I would say, as good a kicks or better kicks than Thiago Santos. And if you guys watched the Jon Jones-Thiago Santos fight, you would know that Thiago did a lot of damage with his kicks, particularly his leg kicks. Now, I don't think Dominick Reyes has quite as good a leg kicks, but I think he has a much better high kick. He does have a few head kick knockouts on his resume, and he also has quite a few other KOs and TKOs on his resume as well, which is further proof that the dude definitely carries some power in both his hands and his feet. Will he knock out Jon Jones? Probably not. Could he hurt him and TKO him? I think that's more likely. I think the most likely scenario to victory for Dominick Reyes, however, is a decision, which, if you watch that Thiago Santos-Jon Jones fight, that might seem a little bit iffy, because in my opinion, I thought Thiago edged that fight 3-2, and you guys saw how the judges scored it, which honestly, that seems to happen with a lot of champions. The old saying, you gotta beat the champion to become the champion, or something like that, is pretty true. Most of the time, if it's a really close competitive fight, the judges are usually going to side with the champion, especially if it's a long-reigning dominant champion like Jon Jones. So does Dominick have to finish him to win the belt? Not necessarily, but I think he needs a more convincing performance than Thiago Santos had, which obviously is going to be difficult, but it's not out of the realm of possibility by any means. In my mind, as well as many other people's minds, Jon Jones is still undefeated. I don't think anyone really pays any credit to that Matt Hamill DQ loss back in the day. So with that said, both fighters, Jon Jones and Dominick Reyes, are basically coming into this weekend's fight undefeated. So one of those O's has to go, but who's it going to be? It is well documented, for the most part, that Jon Jones has definitely had some difficulty with taller fighters. Jon Jones is 6'4", maybe a little bit taller, so he's a tall guy, and for the most part, the majority of his opponents throughout his career have been quite a bit shorter than him, and every single opponent he's ever faced has been at a reach disadvantage. That will not change this weekend as far as the reach goes. Jon Jones has an 84.5-inch reach, which I believe is tied for the longest reach in the UFC, along with maybe Stefan Struve. I might be wrong on that, but either way, the dude's reach is freakishly long, and he definitely is very, very good at using that to his advantage during his fights. Dominick Reyes, on the other hand, is also listed as 6'4", and he has a reach of 77 inches. So once again, Jon Jones is going to have a pretty significant reach advantage. And as I just mentioned, he is very, very good at judging that distance and using that reach to his advantage. So obviously, because of that, Dominick Reyes is going to have to find a way to get inside and land those power shots or those kicks on Jon Jones. That has proved to be very difficult for opponents in the past because, like I keep saying, Jon Jones he's basically a master of distance. He's very good at keeping distance and finding the perfect spots where he can land his shots, but his opponents are just out of reach to land that counter. Another thing that's going to be a little bit challenging for Dominick Reyes is to not get too close, because although Dominick Reyes is a decent wrestler, I think Jon Jones is likely the much better wrestler. He has a very good clinch game, he has sneaky good takedowns, and once he gets that fight to the ground, his opponents are usually in a world of trouble. If the dude gets on top of you, he's got some of the craziest, most damaging elbows in the game. He's finished quite a few fights via TKO from his elbows. One fight that comes to mind is that Brandon Vera fight against Jon Jones, where Bones got on top of him and absolutely smashed him with his elbows en route to a TKO victory. So that's one thing obviously Dominick Reyes has to watch out for. The interesting thing is going to be Jon Jones' game plan. Now, I think everyone going into that Thiago Santos fight thought that Jon Jones would take Thiago to the ground and it would be a short night, an easy TKO victory or a submission victory. As we all saw, that was not the case. It was a very, very close, mostly kickboxing match throughout those 5 rounds. Each fighter landed their fair share of good shots. Unfortunately, Thiago blew out his knee, which undoubtedly definitely affected the outcome of the fight. If he never blew out his knee, who knows? Chances are I'd probably be talking about a new champion right now, but that wasn't the case. Both fighters somewhat injured their knees and legs during that fight. Because like I keep mentioning, there was a ton of leg kicks that each fighter was throwing, and for the most part, they were all very effective. But overall, it was an odd fight and an odd strategy. I've read some things that said Jon Jones maybe was afraid of closing the distance because Thiago Santos is known for his power, and every time Jon Jones tried to get inside, tried to get him to the clinch, he just started winging power shots like a madman, and that kind of made Jon Jones think twice about taking the fight to the mat. I think he felt comfortable on the feet. He felt like he was controlling distance well. It seemed like he felt like he was outpointing Thiago Santos, and he was comfortable outpointing him en route to a decision victory, which is ultimately what ended up happening. But I think a lot of people would agree in saying that fight was probably a lot closer than it needed to be. And if there was and is a rematch down the road, I think it would go down much differently. I think Jon Jones would absolutely take him down. And I personally think it would be a short night for Thiago Santos. But hindsight's 2020. The fight played out the way it did. And I think we learned a lot about Jon Jones' weaknesses from that fight. It kind of, in a way, laid out a blueprint for future opponents on how to finally be the one guy to beat Jon Jones. And that is to force a kickboxing fight with him. So to wrap all this up, Dominick Reyes definitely has a legit shot to beat Jon Jones. Of course, all that is based on whether or not Jon Jones can get the fight to the ground. If he can't, and the fight plays out almost entirely on the feet, I think it's very possible that we could crown a new champion this Saturday night. Let's also not forget that despite how you may feel about Jon Jones, the dude undoubtedly has one of, if not the absolute highest fight IQ in all of MMA. He always finds a way to battle through adversity and somehow come out with a victory, such as his first fight against Gus, or even his most recent fight against Thiago Santos. When he was in there with an injured leg, it was a super close fight, he somehow came away with the victory. Whether or not you agree with the judge's decision on either of those fights, he always finds ways to get things done and somehow come out with the victory. Whether or not you believe the whole picogram theory, or you think he's been roiding the majority of his career, that's definitely up to interpretation. Some people are never going to like the dude and say there will always be an asterisk next to his name because of all those PED accusations, as well as actually being busted quite a few times that turned into the whole picograms gate, or whatever you want to call it. And there's a lot of talk that Jon's also getting older. I think at the moment he's 31 or 32. He's been in the game for a long time. He's been fighting at a very high level for a long time, and a lot of people, justifiably so, I would say, think that he's been slowing down in recent fights, which honestly makes sense based on just the fact that he's getting older. He's been in a ton of fights, and if he was using PEDs at the beginning of his career, when he was finishing dominant former light heavyweight champions left and right, dude seemed like he was completely unstoppable. He was just having his way with everyone. And then came the PED accusations and him eventually getting busted by USADA, and we all saw how that played out. And then I think his first fight back after all that was the OSP fight. A lot of you guys probably saw how that went down. Definitely was not his best performance. The fight was a lot closer than many people thought it would be. And every fight since then, like I mentioned earlier, he's had, one finish in his last 7 fights. So if you compare that to the beginning of his UFC career, there's a pretty huge difference. And I honestly don't think the competition's got any harder at all. If anything, I think it's been a little bit easier lately, because for whatever reason, he's recently been fighting a lot of former 185 pounders that don't quite carry the resume of like a Rashad Evans or a Rampage Jackson or a Shogun Hua. So you got to take all that into consideration. Like I said, depending on which side of the fence you stand on, whether you think he's been roiding his whole career or whether you believe him and believe the picogram thing and think he's a clean athlete, the fact remains that there is a lot of people that, like I said, justifiably so, think he's slowing down. A lot of people think it's because he's finally off the PEDs and he's finally clean. Other people just think father time is catching up to him. Maybe the game is catching up to him, although I don't agree with that because of what I just said earlier. But either way, one thing I definitely do agree with is that it does seem like he's been slowing down his past couple fights, and he's been nowhere near as impressive as he once was a few years ago. It's tough to say though. We don't know. There's been so many different versions of Jon Jones that have come into fights recently, and as I mentioned earlier, It seems like Jon Jones in the past has had much tougher fights against opponents that are much closer to his size. Like the OSP fight, if you go back and watch that, that fight was probably a lot closer than it needed to be. Although he won a fairly runaway decision, he didn't really come close to putting OSP away. I think OSP even had a broken arm early on in that fight. I think that fight was a lot closer than many people expected, but it just kind of further lends credibility to the theory that Jon Jones has a much tougher time with opponents that are closer to his size. In that fight, OSP, I believe, is 6'3". He's got an 80-inch reach, which is probably the longest reach of any opponent that Jon Jones has fought. Dominick Reyes, as I mentioned earlier, has a 77-inch reach, so it won't be quite that close this time. But he is the same height as Jon Jones, and another opponent that Jon Jones had a lot of difficulty with in the first fight, as we all know, was Alexander Gustafsson. That was also a fight that definitely could have gone either way. Obviously, we all saw how the second fight, the rematch, went down not too long ago. But the one thing you have to take into consideration regarding that fight is how Alexander Gustafsson has looked leading up to the fight, and even the fight after that against Anthony Smith. He did not look anywhere near as good as he did going into that first fight. So I'm not really sure how much you can actually take away from that fight. Another guy that Jon Jones recently fought that is the same height as him is Anthony Smith, who's also 6'4" with a 76-inch reach. Now that fight, I wouldn't say was all that competitive. Jon Jones won a fairly dominant unanimous decision, but he did not put away Anthony Smith, and a lot of people, including myself, think he definitely could have and should have. If you go back 8 fights in Jon Jones' career, actually we'll say 7 because we won't count the Daniel Cormier fight that was ultimately overturned because of the failed drug test. So we'll go back and look at his last 7 fights. In his last 7 fights, Jon Jones obviously won all those fights, but 6 out of the 7 were victories via decision. So he's definitely not as dominant as far as finishes go like he was early on in his career, around the time when he took out Shogun in very impressive fashion. He's still winning, but it seems like he's turned into much more of a point fighter, and he's playing a lot more safe these days. And for whatever reason, I just cannot get that Thiago Santos fight out of my head. Going into that fight, I honestly didn't think Thiago Santos had any shot at all to beat Jon Jones. And then after that fight, I honestly cannot believe what I just witnessed. Like I keep mentioning, I thought Thiago Santos did enough to win the fight. Unfortunately for him, the judges didn't see it that way. But like I also already said, I think he exposed a couple holes in Jon Jones' game, and I think Dominick Reyes and his team were absolutely paying attention. I'm sure they've watched that fight a ton of times in preparation for this weekend's fight. Dominick Reyes is a great stand-up fighter. So in summary, taking into consideration how the Thiago Santos-Jon Jones fight went down, along with the difficulties Jon Jones has had in the past against opponents that are relatively equal in size to him, add to that the fact that Dominick Reyes is a great stand-up fighter. He's undefeated. He has a ton of power in both his hands and his feet. And that, my friends, is why I think Dominick Reyes has a pretty solid chance to be the one guy to finally defeat Johnny Bones Jones, dethrone him, and take home the belt this Saturday. Let me know what you guys think down below. Do you think Dominick Reyes has a chance, or do you think Jon Jones is going to cruise to either a dominant decision or finish Dominick Reyes via TKO or knockout? Let me know down below. With that said, that's a wrap for the video. Thanks for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Enjoy the fights this weekend, and I'll catch you in the next one.
Oh my goodness! Oh my God! Just like that! That is some serious power! Wow! And